but in a positive change arc where you have a character who starts out the story with a limiting belief of some kind. That's the essence of the story. The entire story is going to be built to put that character into situations that are going to challenge that belief, show him the limitations, and if he arcs positively, is going to bring him out of that into a greater truth.
This episode is brought to you by Bulletproof Script Coverage, where screenwriters go to get their scripts read by top Hollywood professionals. Learn more at covermyscreenplay.com. I'd like to welcome back to the show returning champion, Katie Weiland. How you doing, Katie?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you for coming back on the show. Your first appearance on the show about character arcs was extremely popular. A lot of people really, really liked it. A lot of people in the tribe really, really liked it. So when I saw that you had a new book out covering theme, of course, I had to invite you back to chat about theme.
Character arcs and theme are two of my favorite subjects, so I'm really excited to talk about those.
And your new book is called Writing Your Story's Theme?
Yes. Right.
And it just came out a few weeks ago as of this recording. So
yeah.
And it's already #1 on like multiple lists on Amazon already and everything. So it's
that's always exciting.
It's always exciting being on. Yeah, I remember when you get that little orange thing next to like #1 bestseller on your. It's like you're like, that's so nice. It's so nice when you do that. So, all right. So, can you define what a theme is? The theme of a story is for the audience.
Yeah. So, I think that's kind of like why I wrote the book, because I think that there's a lot of ways that we can think about theme, and there are a lot of ways that people approach it. You'll have one person talking about it in this aspect, and then somebody talking in the other, and there's a lot of confusion, I think, because of that. Particularly about applying theme, because some of those descriptions are not practical. Some of them are just very abstract. So you can have theme as just like a unifying idea of the story, something like that. If you can have thematic metaphors in which the story represents something. It's an example of something that it's demonstrating from within. But for me, the way that I approach theme and the way that I have found it most interesting and most practicable is to think of it, to realize that really what it is the meeting of plot and character. And that particularly when I was working on the character arcs book, it became really clear to me that when you're developing character arc, what you're doing is proving your theme. And this is true ultimately whether people are trying to impose a theme onto the story apart from the character arc or not. What your character undergoes and how he changes over the course of the story, that ultimately is what your story is about. And whatever, we'll call it a lesson, although I don't really like that because it's very moral of the story-ish. But whatever lesson that character is learning, whether it's existential or moral, or, I mean, it can be very deep or very shallow, but that ultimately is what your story is putting out into the world and what it's positing about our reality. And that ultimately is the theme of the story. So if you can identify that through line, where your plot and your character come together, and also it like harmonizes this debate we have between plot versus character and which is better, because together they come together and they create the theme of the story and this beautiful through line. And then of course there's so much complexity that arises out of that, and how we're then able to bring in symbolism and bring in all kinds of layers of metaphor to really garnish kind of the theme as we go along.
To support the theme, if you will.
Yeah.
Well, does every story have a theme?
I believe yes.
Even the bad stories?
Well, that's a good question. I think that I've always taken issue with this idea that people will talk about just a story. I think that's total baloney. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately, one way or another, a story is always saying something about our world. Sometimes it's saying it really well. Sometimes it's not saying it very well at all. I think a big problem with a lot of stories that don't work is they don't really know what they're saying. And so they're just kind of throwing out multiple messages. They're still saying something, but it's not a unified, cohesive, and resonant kind of a whole. But yeah, I think every time you put a visual on the screen, every time your character says something, every sentence on the page, that's saying something. And within the patterns that arise in a larger work, you're always going to have a theme, whether it's well executed or not.
So can I do like a couple of rapid fire movie titles and see if you can decipher a theme for me? Just like
Sure.
off the top.
I've seen them.
If you've seen them, I'm going to try to choose some very popular ones. So any of the Indiana Joneses, like what is the theme of Indiana Jones? Because he's one of the more famous characters in cinema history.
Yeah, so Indiana Jones is interesting because he is a character that is typically seen not to have a character arc. You know, he's very
Bond-esque.
Same.
Old
right,
Bond-esque.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. It's very episodic. I mean, that's the way it was designed to be, as like the old serial shows.
Sherlock Holmes, right.
It's been a long time since I've seen those movies.
Uh-huh.
I would say the first one, we definitely can see themes of responsibility. In the end, in the climax, we see how the bad guys, the Nazis, are disregarding the Ark of the Covenant and are not respecting the history and the archaeology. And Indy does, and Indy survives, and they die. So right there, I think even just in that, we have a statement, you know, from the storytellers about what they think, you know, is a truth, and inherent in that is a theme.
So the theme is basically, like, I think you just said that clear word. It's a statement. So the storyteller is creating a statement for the world to understand through the story that they're writing, essentially. And that's what, as a writer, you should start thinking about the theme or the statement that you're trying to make through character, which then in turn goes through character, plot, and then essentially theme. And then I think, isn't theme essentially character and plot kind of
exactly
together?
Yeah. I think there's this like misconception, I consider it a misconception, that it was definitely something that I was taught a lot or read a lot when I was starting out. It was basically like, don't think about your theme. Don't write a theme. Because if you do, one of two things will happen. Either you'll end up with this horrible moral of a story, or you'll end up, you know, just trying to hammer this theme into a story and it doesn't fit and it's inorganic. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I think once you understand that theme just emerges organically when your plot and your character are working together. So I think it's really important and amazing when an author has a passionate statement that they want to make. But at the same time, I would be a little cautious of that, because you don't want it to end up, you know, being so moralistic that that's all the story is about. And it's the art of story is making the plot and the character arc an external metaphor for the theme. So there are many stories that never actually say what they're about. They never state what the theme is. But if they're really well done, then just simply through the scenes, the visual scenes, through the characters and their interactions, and ultimately through how the characters have changed and what is decided in the climactic moment of the conflict, the readers and the viewers get it. You know, we see very clearly what is I mean, Indiana Jones is a great example, because we see, it's very visual. We see exactly what is being said in this story. So buy it or not.
Right, exactly. So just so everybody understands listening, so if the author, if we lived in an alternate universe where I think there is a show called the man on top castle or something like that, where the Nazis won, and Indiana Jones then would have been never called Indiana Jones. It would have called the Nazis, or just trying to find some archaeological experiments. If that whole concept was switched, where then the bad guys win, the good guys lose, and that's just the way it's supposed to be, that's a statement by the storyteller stating that that's the way the world should be. That's what they're trying to put out there into the world. That's the theme of the story. So, and then it's up to you to believe it or not. So it almost becomes a propaganda, but propaganda, now we're getting into another conversation where propaganda is all about point of view. In the point of view of the Nazis, it's not propaganda, it's a story. But from our point of view, it's like, that's just essentially propaganda.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good example, actually, about point of view, in that we could, and we have many stories that do not end well, that seem to be positing something that most of us would completely disagree with. But because of the way it's done, you know, it's done with irony. We understand, like, this is not, like, this isn't literally what the filmmaker or the writer is saying, but they're using irony to kind of say the exact opposite. Whereas in other stories, it's completely on the nose and like, yeah, Nazis are great. That's the message. And that is, you know, where we get into the whole thing of propaganda.
Right. Well, I mean, just using a movie like Thelma and Louise. I mean, it does not end happily. I mean, they do not
exactly.
they do not ride off into the sunset. They kind of do, but not in the way that we normally. And I think that was also a beautifully twist that they did. They literally did ride off into the sunset, but unfortunately, spoiler alert, off a cliff. So, but the themes in that movie are so powerful, and that story are so powerful, and so it's. And it's, I mean, it is pretty on the nose. I don't know. How would you, like, I mean, I'm assuming you've seen Thelma and Louise.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So it's on the nose, but it's not, though. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I was going to say that I think that it's much easier to do themes that are not on the nose when they don't end happy. It's not to say happy endings don't work or aren't resonant, but when everything works out, you know, when the hero is the shining knight of truth and he's completely rewarded for this, it doesn't resonate. It doesn't ring true. And so I think in a movie like Thelma and Louise, which ends tragically, there's this resonance because there's also a triumph. There's also a heroism in the way it ends because they end in alignment with the story's truth, even though it also is, you know, the end of their lives and therefore a tragic end to the story. But I think that's a really important point, actually. It's not that you can't end happy endings. We all love happy endings. But it's important that the happy ending, if that's what you're doing, is earned. That the character, whether they have represented the thematic truth throughout the story or they've come to it in the end, that it hasn't been easy. Because I think we all resonate with that, because in our own lives, it's not easy. And we kind of resent it when the hero is just like, everything's just super easy for him. And then he can shake his finger at us in the end and say, see, that was the truth. Everybody should do this. And we resent the authors is what we resent when that happens.
And I'll use one of the movies. I bring this movie up a lot because it's such a powerful story. A very popular story, not powerful, but a very popular story in the zeitgeist of the world right now are the Avengers and the whole Marvel universe, where I'm assuming, did you see the last Avengers, the Endgame one? Okay, so, and again, if no one's seen it, please stop the recording because I'm going to give you a couple of spoiler alerts here, but the end of that movie, it could so easily just been a normal, the good guys beat up the bad guys. There's no risk. There's no loss, no nothing. But yet in that they created not only a little loss, a massive loss where Tony Stark essentially sacrifices himself because the obstacle was so large that someone had to die. And that made that resonate so much more than everyone sitting around eating shawarma at the end of the movie, which worked fine for the first Avengers, but not so much for the last one because they had built it up over 10 years. Someone had to die in order for this to work. So would you agree?
Yeah, totally. I was really psyched that basically they brought the story to an end. Even though supposedly it's going to continue in other movies, they brought that story to an end. And that's something that I find is very problematic in serial fiction, whether it's, TV series that just go on and on and on, or things, potentially like the Marvel universe. There's no end. And if there's no end, there's no meaning ultimately, because you're not saying this is what the story is about. And also it's really hard, like you say, to ramp those stakes and say this matters if there isn't an end and there aren't consequences. So yeah, I that was something, that series as a whole, big Marvel fan, but it was, like you say, it had its problems. It wasn't a seamless presentation by any means, but I was very happy and very impressed with what they did by bringing it full circle in that final story in a lot of ways. First and foremost, for bringing it to an end, but also I just thought it was just fantastic how they brought it for full circle. How the very first movie, we go all the way back to Iron Man. It ends with him saying, "I am Iron Man." And then we get to come all the way to the end, and it means something completely different.
Yes.
In the beginning, it's totally egoic. In the end, it's totally self-sacrificial. So I thought that was very powerful, a very powerful example of why we need to bring stories to an end.
And also, and we want to talk about thematic. Comic books, specifically the Marvel comic book characters, the themes are so, Stan, God rest in peace, he created some of the most memorable characters in human history, essentially. but their themes are extremely powerful. And I think that's one of the things that resonates so powerfully with people around the world. Every one of those, and it's not stories that have themes, but I feel that the characters have theme more, because there's a theme attached to Spider-Man and to Hulk and to Fantastic Four and to X-Men. X-Men is racism and being a loner and standing out. Spider-Man is being a young kid just trying to figure things. Hulk is obviously anger. Fantastic Four is family issues. But they're themes associated to character. Can you attach themes to characters? I mean, obviously you can, but what's your take on that?
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to bring it back to plot and character, because and honestly, the whole Marvel, if we look at the whole Marvel cinematic universe, through that story arc, there's a bazillion different plots going on. Everybody's got their own plot. Every movie's got its own plot, and really, at the end of the day, it's not the plots we remember. We don't think about, oh, that was such a great plot in that particular movie, because most of them weren't. The plots were very problematic in a lot of those movies.
Like I could remember, like when you said that, I'm like, which are the plots? I remember like Winter Soldier was really good. Winter Soldier is probably one of the best, and there's like a handful of like plots that I remember, but I don't remember the plots as much.
Yeah, you remember the characters, and I think that it's exactly because theme is so rooted in character, and the series works as a whole, overarching, because that does have a plot, that has a unifying plot in which everything kind of works together, with Thanos as the antagonist, which is another good point about how antagonists pull together the plot, which is why a lot of the individual movies had their problems with plot. Mm-hmm. But it's the characters. Theme is inherent in the character arc. It's inherent in the internal conflict between thematic lies and truths that happen on a character level. And you can stick, themes onto the surface of a plot and say this plot is about why war is evil or whatever. But if it's not happening inside of the character, if you're not just feeling that struggle, then you're really going to struggle to execute a meaningful theme that is going to resonate with viewers or readers.
Now, what is the thematic principle?
Okay, thematic principle is basically a term for any iteration of theme that you find in your story. So it's the unifying idea, though. When you are trying to figure out what is my theme, and you're, looking at like, well, it's kind of about this and it's kind of about that, the thematic principle is going to be your through line. So that is something that once you identify it, once you identify what is at the heart of specifically the protagonist's character development, that is going to become the thematic principle for the story, and is something that you can then kind of use up as a plumb line to measure all the other little elements and decide, is this working? Is this supporting the theme? Is it proving the theme? Or is it just kind of extraneous and really telling a different story altogether?
Now, how do you prevent theme from becoming a little bit on the nose or preachy? Because we've all seen movies or read books that are a little bit on the nose, a little bit like, stop preaching to me so much and just tell me a story.
I think that's a good question, because so many of us, if we're interested in theme at all, it's probably because we really are passionate about certain topics and we want to be able to comment on them or share our views in some degree. And honestly, that's a tricky thing to do in the medium of fiction, because when you are on the nose, when you say, this is the way it is, this is what I think, and you should think it too, it never goes well. But I think one of my favorite ways to look at this, and it isn't explicit, but one of my favorite kind of rules of thumb, is to think of it as if stories are not there to provide answers. They're there to ask questions. And I think this is most powerful when the author himself is asking the question. Because, we all have our ideas about how we think things should be or how things will turn out if this and this happens. But I think when the author, him or herself, really inhabits that question, whether they think they know the answer or not, and explores it from within the drama of the story, throws the characters into the plot and lets events start happening, to really explore that, you have to get down on the ground and get down and dirty and really question your own beliefs about things. Otherwise, the characters do not ring true. And I've always said that if you're not almost convinced by your antagonist's point of view, then you're not writing him right. And your theme is probably going to come across very one-sided. I think the most powerful themes are the ones where the protagonist, and to some degree the author, and to some degree the readers, have a serious question about what about the worldview that's being presented. Is this working? Is this really how it's going to be because of the sacrifices that are involved and the moral gray areas and all of that? I think Sam Raimi's, speaking of Marvel, I think Sam Raimi's versions of his original 2 Spider-Man movies,
first 2,
did a really great job of this. Really explored the consequences of heroism and responsibility, and I mean, we really see that even in the second one, where Peter's like completely questioning, do I even want to be Spider-Man? This stinks. I don't want to do this. And that really flies in the face of kind of the surface obvious way to go about, being a hero is great. This is awesome. If everybody wants to, have these powers.
Right.
And to me, that was a very powerful exploration of that subject.
Yeah, I mean, because you're right, because everybody wants to have powers, but that's what made Stan so amazing, is that he gave superheroes problems. Yeah. Like Superman never had any, issues with his relationships, at the beginning. Batman was pretty one-dimensional. Like, he's like, and Wonder Woman did that, and Aquaman did that. But when you got into the Marvel, I mean, you got Spider-Man who had pimples and was dealing with, being a nerd at school, like everybody else has dealt with at one point in their life or another, and giving those problems. That's, I think, what made those characters they resonate so much even to this day. And that's why I guess the popularity of the MCU so much is because Ant-Man, Guardians of the Galaxy, like when Ant-Man and Guardians of the Galaxy came out, I was like, wow, man, they are just scraping nobody wants to see an Ant-Man movie. And yet Ant-Man was like an amazing heist film. It was just like a fun heist film almost. I mean, it was just, it's remarkable. But you also said something earlier in regards to antagonists bringing together the theme. Can you kind of delve into that a little bit more? Like using, let's say, Thanos as an example, because Thanos was such an overarching, he was only the true villain in two movies, right? It was the last 2 Avengers. He was the actual villain, where he always was kind of like, he was the puppet master for the first 8 years or something like that. And then he just showed him, he's like, well, apparently no one else is going to get it done, so I'll show up and take care of it. But how does a character like Thanos kind of bring together the theme of that whole overarching first 10 years of the MCU?
Well, I think to me, the best entry point to that question is really to look at how the antagonist kind of defines the plot. And obviously, as we've been talking about, plot, theme, character, they're all 3 sides of the same thing, basically. So you can hardly talk about one without talking about the other. But the antagonist is, as the obstacle that is opposing the protagonist in the story, he's what creates the conflict. So no antagonist, no conflict, no story. The protagonist just, goes straight to finish and gets $200 or whatever. Right. And but the antagonist is, I'll get that. So yeah, there's a horrible bad guy out there in the distance that we know is going to show up and be the big boss in the climax. But if that antagonist isn't consistently what is opposing the protagonist throughout the structure of the story, then ultimately the story, at its best, it still kind of works, but it loses that deep cohesion and resonance because the protagonist is off doing other stuff. He's, dealing with other antagonists. And I think we see that again and again in the Marvel movies. It's like the antagonist is this kind of the subplot. He's off doing whatever, shows up for the big battle. And most of the time it's more interesting personal problems that are actually the plot of the story, like Iron Man 2 immediately comes to mind.
Like Black Panther had a great antagonist. Yeah. He has there's a handful of really good villains. Very few though. I would say probably like 5 out of all the movies that were like, holy cow, these are really good. I mean, I think Warmonger is actually going to get his own spin-off movie.
Oh, really?
I heard through the geek vine that he's actually gonna get his own spin-off, because he was just the opposite side of the coin of Black Panther, and he arguably was was right, and in regards to what his world point of view was. Even Black Panther agreed with him. He just didn't agree with how he was doing it, but he agreed with it. That's what made it so amazing, because the hero is not supposed to agree with the point of view of the villain, but yet you're like, look, you're right. Things were bad, but you just can't go around killing people.
Yeah, I think that Black Panther is actually a good example of kind of both sides of the coin, in that structurally it struggled with the antagonist a little bit. It had some issues with the antagonist being there throughout the story and being, he kind of doesn't show up until, I want to say, like halfway through almost, really. Like he's
because they had to set up. Yeah, they had to kind of set everything up, right?
Anyway, but he's also a great example of what I was saying about how we need to be almost convinced by the antagonist's point of view. And when that happens, that really is like the generator of all of this potential for amazing change within the protagonist. And when the protagonist starts changing, or any character, but particularly the protagonist, that's where theme is generated, because it can't help but just spontaneously emerge from what's happening, from the events in the story.
Well, yeah, Thanos' point of view is like, look, everything's overpopulated. We need to thin the herd. I mean, again, rough conversation to have. Do we agree with the concept of all the resources are being taken away and there are too many, creatures in the universe and things like that, but you can't just kill everybody with the snap of a finger. So the point of view is that's what I think always find a good villain to be, in a good theme for a villain is the twisting of the mustache character side. Oh, they're just horrible. They're just like, oh, he's just being bad because there's no point. We've been watching a lot since we've been locked up. A lot of old movies again, a lot of old shows again. And when you see a villain, you're like, oh, that villain has no point of view. And the whole movie dies. The whole story falls apart when there's no real strong point of view. But when the villain does have that strong, and you're right, theme just kind of just flourishes right out of that, because it has to. There is no other way. It has to be there.
Yeah, it's like the protagonist, comes in and says, this is the right way to do it. And then as soon as the antagonist comes up with a convincing argument why that's not so, it's just the protagonist is just kind of like, oh, well, plan B, I guess. Except there is no plan B. And so then all of a sudden there's like genuine, character development, story development, unexpected, original events that come out of that, because it is so genuine in that the author or the storytellers are really, having that discussion with themselves. Like, right. Oh, well, maybe my hero is not as right as I thought he was. What does that mean? And all kinds of interesting things come out of that.
Absolutely. Now, thematically, a film series and a character like James Bond, original James Bond, pre-Daniel Craig, what is the theme of those movies? Womanize, drink a lot of alcohol, and then just kill people indiscriminately.
Yeah, I haven't seen any of the ones before Daniel Craig, but of course I'm familiar with the gist of them. I don't. Yeah, see that to me is an example of every story has a theme, but just because it's saying something doesn't necessarily mean that it's having a positive influence on the world.
Right. Because James Bond, honestly, before Daniel Craig, once Casino, of course, I always consider Casino Royale probably the best James Bond movie, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, I really like that one.
I mean, it's just, it's a masterpiece in that genre. But he was a character. He had a character arc. James Bond never had a character arc before. Sean Connery's, and Pierce Brosnan, they were the same dude from the beginning to the end. They never really changed. They just kind of went along. Not even the people around them changed. I mean, maybe some of the female toys that he used along the way, like the Bond girls, which is so out of date. But that, for the time that it came out, it was it. But you go back and thinking, this is not a message that kind of resonate. Now, if you just forget all about the message, just enjoy the ride, then I get it. It's a ride, and you're going along. Yeah. He's the good guy's trying to stop the bad guy, but it's not really deep.
Yeah, and I think that's fine to a point. But that's why I say there's no such thing as just a story. Because anything that you're bringing into your environment that is becoming a part of your own, view of the world and your own reality, that's changing you in some way or another, whether you're it could be conscious, it could be not. So I think that's a great example. I haven't seen those movies, so I can't directly comment on them. I've only seen the Daniel Craig ones. But I think it's a great example of how mindless entertainment is never actually harmless entertainment. There's always something that is affecting your view of the world.
You're absolutely right, because like mindless video games and things like that, people are like, because video games are stories, and we're telling a story with the video games. You're just performing the story yourself. But a lot of times those stories and those kind of mindless movies or mindless shows, there's something coming through. Sometimes it's not good. And it does have an effect on people, whether that be ultra violence, whether that be misogyny, whether it be, the Nazis win. I mean, any of those kind of things. It's as storytellers, we have a very big responsibility. With, especially if you're given the platform and millions of dollars to make a movie or a show, we have a big responsibility, and the creators have a big responsibility to what I love. What you've been saying this a couple times, the deposit. What are you depositing into, the statement you're making? You're depositing this into the world's narrative now. That's a very powerful statement. And I love that you said, I might actually steal that. Because it's true. Every time you tell a story, you're depositing it into the library of the human experience that might live for a long time or might just fall off to the wasteland. But it is extremely important that you have this responsibility. Would you agree?
Yeah, totally. That's something I'm very happy you said that, actually, because that's something I'm really passionate about. Just in that, I think there's so much entertainment is so available to us now, and it's so easy for people to create it. And I think that's great. I mean, I think storytelling is a deeply important thing for anybody to do. That it's very powerful just on a personal level, never mind if you're actually able to, share that with other people. But I think we are able to share what we're creating more and more easily with people around us. There's just so many platforms, and it's so easy, easy to, get out there and have an audience. And most of us do it because it's fun. It's entertaining. It's fun, and we just want to entertain other people. And that's fine to a point, but I do think we have to truly recognize the responsibility of what we're doing. It's one thing to say, this is my view of the world, I want you to believe it. It's another thing to write a story about it, particularly a relatively well-crafted story, which ultimately is a subliminal message. Most people are not conscious of of the truths that they're receiving through stories. If the themes are really well done, nobody's saying them, but they're there just the same. They're being proven, through the reality of the story, through the visuals and the events. And I believe very strongly that it's deeply important for artists of all stripes, but particularly storytellers in this context, to recognize that. The power is yours to do what you will with, but be conscious of it, because there is no such thing as just a story. Even if you are the only person who reads it, it's still affecting you. It's changing you. And insofar as it changes you, it's going to have a ripple effect that changes the world around you.
It is arguably one of the most powerful things that the humans have created, is story, because a story can change a person's perspective, point of view. It could go bad or it can go good, and that's also relatively speaking. Like I always tell people, Hitler didn't wake up every morning thinking he was the bad guy. Yep. He woke up every morning like, I'm doing God's work. Like, that was his. I mean, as a villain, you have to think like Darth Vader is not sitting around going, I'm so bad. No, it's always about a point of view, and but it is, we as filmmakers have to think that. And I know you've probably seen this as well when you read stories by first time writers or young writers. That's not there. They're not thinking that far ahead in regards to the story of how this story could actually affect people. They're just trying to get a story written. That's hard enough, let alone like, oh God, you can throw this responsibility on me now that I have to like, oh my God, I have a loaded shotgun and I'm walking around with them. Like, no, look, yes. But don't worry, you're not going to kill anybody with a story. Hopefully. But but it is a responsibility. But you don't see that, and only when you start seeing like the master's work, then you start seeing they just weave theme in so effortlessly. Characters almost so effortlessly that you just go, oh, okay. So when you start reading Shakespeare, that dude, or you start reading, even current day masters like Stephen King or J.K. Rowling in the Harry Potter series, like you start looking at the stuff that they did and how they wrote it. It's just, but the themes just pop so heavily in all of those things.
Yeah, and I think you use the word master, and I think that's the key there, is that they've mastered the plot, they've mastered the character, and because of that, like I say, the theme emerges, and it's there, and it's so powerful because the stories they're writing are so cohesive, they're so resonant, all the pieces are there for a reason, and they had, I think, both Stephen King and probably Rowling, they have things they want to say, and they say them, well. They say them, through the honesty of their own stories, and that has clearly resonated with millions of people. But yeah, I think it is perhaps good for writers who are starting out to realize that it's not the weight of the world on your shoulders. It's more about just a consciousness. Don't approach it with fear and trembling, but don't approach it with this, sobriety. Approach it with that same childlike wonder that you had when you were a kid and you were making up, probably stories of greater truth than you will ever write as an adult. And it was just fun, you were just tapped into it and it was fun and exciting. And then I think we start overthinking it as adults. We're like so serious with the responsibility of our adultness and how we've got to make sure that everybody else is just as responsible. And then we start writing stuff that's on the nose. We lose the muse. We lose that childlike innocence, really. It's not just the wonder, but the innocence that allows us to ask questions, to just step into that story world and look around and see, what do I think? I don't know. Let's find out. Let's, throw some characters out there and see what happens. And maybe by the end, I will have been impacted by this more than anybody who reads it. But it's exciting. It needs to be something that we take seriously. But I definitely think that ultimately it's still about having fun. It's still about entering that kind of that dream zone and just playing.
Absolutely. Now, we talked a lot about character affecting theme. How can you use plot specifically? How can we use plot to help create our theme?
Yeah, so like I say, plot, character, theme, they're what I call the big three. And really, if your story is working well, then they are seamlessly, organically, even effortlessly going to be working together. So if your plot is working really well, then it's almost certain that your characters and your theme are also there. And if something's wrong with your plot, it's probably because something's off with one of the other two. But specifically, if you look at character arc and how that works over the entirety of the story, you can see how deeply tied in it is with plot structure. More or less all plot structure systems are pointing to the same thing, just with different perspectives. I specifically use the 3-act structure, and you can just pretty much just overlay a basic character arc structure onto the plot structure, and they interact. You can't have one without the other. It's not like the character's off doing his little subplot development while the James Bond action is happening over here.
Yeah, because then they wouldn't be,
unless you're James Bond.
But that's also, then you wouldn't be the main character. You'd be a sub character.
Yeah, so it's happening together. The internal conflict is what is prompting the character to act in the external conflict, and then the external conflict is coming back and asking him to question within himself what he's doing and why he's doing it. And so it's from within that the character has certain mindsets and ideas that he wants to accomplish, and the plot is then through the conflict and the consequences and the stakes is going to prove one way or the other whether the character's initial ideas are true. And from that is where theme emerges. So,
but can you talk a little bit about the difference between theme and a message? Because that is, there's a subtleness to that.
Yeah. So I think it was Michael Hauge who wrote Writing Screenplays That Sell, I believe.
Yeah, Michael Haig. Michael Haig. Yeah.
Michael Haig. Okay. Yeah. So I believe he was the one that differentiated that, or there was the first person I'd seen who differentiated theme from message. And I thought that was such a keen observation. And the way he defines them basically is that theme is a universal principle. It's we'll just say love conquers all, something that everybody resonates to, regardless who they are, where they live, their circumstances. Message, however, is very specific to the situation within the story. So the message is something that is only going to apply to people who are like the protagonist, people who are in this same situation. Like I'm trying to think of something that has to do with love conquers all. But, your specific love story, right? Yeah. It's like it only applies to you and your partner. It's not something that's necessarily, the lessons that you learned and the theme of that isn't something that's necessarily going to apply to all people everywhere, even though we all relate to the idea of love.
Right.
So I think that's really important because it allows you to play out the specifics of a scenario and yet still have something to say to a much broader audience.
Beauty and the Beast. Love conquers all. I was racking like love conquers all. Love conquers all. Love conquers all. Like Beauty and the Beast. Perfect. Okay, there's.
Yeah. And how many of us, have to go through that where you're, it's the Beast and you have to redeem him and
Well, that's
pretty specific.
That's arguably that it's according to my wife, not that specific.
Well, that's true. That's the beauty of it, because it is like a supremely archetypal story. And yet, again, the specifics of it, particularly in the fairy tale medium, very specific. The message, is, don't make the fairy mad when she comes to your castle, or she's going to curse you and you're going to have to go through all this.
So let's since we've touched upon the fairy tale is these stories have been around for hundreds, if not some of them even thousands of years, some of these stories, and they're so archetypal. They're so on the nose. Like Beauty and the Beast is fairly on the nose. There is nothing subtle about Beauty and the Beast or Little Mermaid or Lion King, or I'm going through Disney movies now, but they're very on the nose. Those themes are those kind of stories are extremely important to the human condition. Love conquers all is a very powerful and important theme that as humans we should understand, or at least have some sort of inkling of what that is. These stories, like I always love that George Lucas said this. He's like, myth is essentially the meat and potatoes of our society, and that's how we pass along the core elements, like love conquers all, good versus bad, be honest, the boy who cried wolf, these kind of like these kind of themes. I'd love to hear your take on that, on fairy tales and what the power of what they do. Archetypal stories are something else that I'm very passionate about. And I think I would argue that they are not on the nose. I think that they are, because they are so metaphoric. I mean, they're not literal. Nobody actually turns into a beast. They're not cursed by fairies and turn into a beast. That's a metaphor. And therefore, even though the stories are very straightforward and even simplistic in some ways, they're not on the nose simply because they're not literal. If you had the boy who cried wolf, if that was a story where the mother told the boy stop lying and the boy came in and it's no longer about what's actually being dramatized. It's specifically like in my book, in the theme book, I talk about how when I was in middle school I had to read these stories about kids who did kid stuff. They had to mow the lawn to earn some money. They found a lost wallet and they had to return it. It was like these little lessons about how to be a good kid, Mm-hmm.
And that's all they were. There was nothing about them that wasn't literally, this is what you're supposed to do as a kid. And I hated them, even as a kid. They're so preachy and on the nose. But stories, I think, like, anything where you find that really archetypal element, whether it's fairy tales or Star Wars or comic books, I think it's because they transcend the literal. Spider-Man is just a teenage kid who reminds all of us of ourselves at some point in our lives. but he has spider powers. That's nothing that any of us actually relate to. It's just a metaphor and a hyperbole of our own lives.
Now, we've talked about theme in regards to, like, I think you were talking about it's a concept of love conquers all and certain themes within stories, but genre has such a powerful point in regards to theme, whereas there's certain things that you just can't do with theme because of the genre they're in. And then sometimes when you can transcend that, because then you've really hit, like Get Out is an amazing example of taking the horror genre and completely flipping it on his head thematically.
Yeah, I think genre, actually, to me, genre stories are very archetypal. I think the essence of genre is archetype. We have most obviously perhaps in the romance genre, but also in many, many different, the very fact that there are tropes and there are templates that readers expect you to follow, that creates an archetype. But most of them are even more deeply rooted in archetype than even just modern conventions about the actual genre. So yeah, there are certain themes that are inherent in certain genres. Love conquers all being an obvious one for romance, or the good conquers evil being an obvious one for action adventure stories, things like that. And so, yeah, I think we can see that they're archetypal because they're stories that are perennially asking the same questions. Because we say love conquers all or good triumphs over evil. But then there's that part of us that has a question. Like there is a deep part of us that believes in those things. But for most of us, there's also a question, too. Does love conquer all? Does good always triumph over evil? And so I think
no.
Yeah.
No, that's just no. The answer is because we live in the real world.
Exactly. And I think that the really good genre stories are the ones that keep asking those same questions over and over in ways that give us fresh insights into what really are not perennial statements, but are perennial questions within the human existence.
One thing that I found, one of the storytellers that I've always studied and loved, I'm a big fan of as a writer-director, is James Cameron, because he is obviously he knows how to tap into something because his track record is nobody else has ever had a track record. Nobody, not even Spielberg, not even. It's just a very specific track record that he's created for himself. But what I've noticed in all of his stories, he does something that is really interesting. He actually not only smashes genres together, but also I'm not sure if he smashes themes together, but he definitely mashes genres together. So if you look at Terminator, his first real work, it's an action adventure, but it's a love conquers all story. You look at The Abyss, action adventure, love conquers all. Titanic, action adventure, love conquers all. And then some other themes in there as well about classism and that kind of stuff. Same thing with Avatar, action adventure, love conquers all. And then then there's also, environmental themes and other things like that he threw in there, but he slams all of this stuff together. So Avatar is a really good example of that. There is a lot of stuff going on in Avatar thematically.
Yeah, I think that it's, first of all, I think what you've presented there is a good example of how you can have a main through line of where the theme and the plot and the character all come together and provide that cohesion and resonance. And then you can still explore, other things that come up naturally through the story's premise. But I would specifically like to reference Terminator and Titanic, because I think that the thing to me about James Cameron, because he is, like you say, does all these crazy things with genre. And yet, underlying it, particularly for those two movies, I feel, is this rock solid archetypal story. Mm-hmm. And I think we don't always notice it because it's not the hero's journey. And this is something that I'm really excited about right now, and I'm going to start writing about on my site hopefully next year. But just the realization that we are so fixated on the hero's journey, like that's the only archetypal underpinning for all stories everywhere. And of course it's not. And I think that actually something that I realized in reading Kim Hudson's, her book was called The Virgin's Promise, I think, but she posits specifically like a countertype character journey that's more feminine based. And in that too, she talks about how really that's just the first act. The hero, Virgin and the hero are just the first act of human existence. Most stories do not even tap, the more mature archetypes of the second act, much less our elder archetypes in the third act. So this is something I've really been researching this year and I'm really excited about. But to me, why James Cameron was so fantastically on point in Terminator and Titanic specifically was he nailed the virgin journey. He nailed that version, that feminine journey. Yeah. And not just within the character arc, but specifically in Terminator, the whole thing is a metaphor for that feminine journey. You've got the protector and the predator, and then how in the end they both die and she's the one who has to deal with it. And it's just fantastic. I love Terminator. So.
The first Terminator and the second one are just the best of the series.
Yeah. Anyway, but really, I think what it is, for me anyway, why those stories work is not just because they're well told, well plotted, not just because they're entertaining or have something to say, but because they are just rock solid on that archetypal level.
Yeah. And yeah, they take the virgin story, but then they also take, I mean, if you look at Terminator is such a brilliant, just a genius piece of literature, not literature, but of cinema, but just writing, the storytelling in that is so complex. But it's on its surface, there's a big dude with a gun trying to kill two other people. That's on the surface, but that's the brilliance of Cameron, I think, is that on the surface, it's about the Titanic. It's about that's what the thing when I heard about Titanic, I'm like, James, man, like we all know where the ending, we all know where this is going. Like, how can you be excited about a movie that you know the ending to? But yet he was able to pull that off in such a way. And I'm always fascinated. I always love talking to people who really analyze and study story about Avatar, because Avatar's story and theme, I mean, thematically, Avatar is pretty. It borders preachy sometimes. It borders preachy. But yet, how was it? Because it wasn't just the cool visuals, because we've seen cool visuals before. There was something else that resonated in the human condition that made it the biggest movie in the world of all time, and arguably still is one of the biggest movies of all time. What did he do in that story, from your point of view, that connected thematically? Because I think the themes are extremely, love conquers all. You have to protect obviously the environmental themes, very big good versus evil themes. Like, what did you think about that?
It's been a long time since I've seen that movie, and I only saw it once, so right. I'm trying to remember. I think everything you've said, is really true, and is what gives it a big feel. I would say, though, that really as far as I remember, because again, it's been at least 10 years since I've seen it. Mm-hmm. It's that character, the main character, and how we get a good character arc from him. And also there's that, this relatability because of the situation that he's in. He's crippled. He, gets to go off into video game land and, have a whole new body. And, I think there's always something powerful about, first of all, completely understanding why a character is the way they are and why they're doing what they're doing. Because he's kind of a jerk in the beginning, if I remember right.
He was.
Yeah, but we still, you can still get why he's doing what he's doing, because of, this deep motivation that I want my body back, basically. I want to be able to walk again. And then to be able to take that and arc it. It's a really tricky thing when you're doing a positive change arc, and so the character has to start at basically a deficit. He starts in a negative place and then arcs to the positive. So how do you make the character in the beginning somebody who's likable, and that the readers, aren't just immediately fed up with, because he doesn't get it. He's not on the right side of it. And in a complex story that particularly arises out of, complex lies that the character might believe, and why he's, confused in the beginning, because we all are, so there's a deep relatability there. But even in characters who aren't as inherently likable, I think when we understand where they're coming from, that's really a really powerful way to begin the character arc and therefore the theme, because we'll follow them. If you're not going to follow the character, you're never going to get to the juicy parts of the theme.
Well, I mean, I think you touched on something, that characters are driven by the story that they've told themselves about the world, about how the world works. And that's, James Bond has a very specific story he tells himself to get up in the morning. Indiana Jones has one. Luke Skywalker at the beginning of Star Wars has one, as opposed to at the end of the trilogy. He has another story he tells himself. And a lot of times, humans specifically now, in the story, but also in real life, we will fight tooth and nail to defend our story point of view, our life point of view. And it's extremely difficult to change that perspective, because that could be societal, that could be the experiences you've had in life. Like if you're a girl and were beaten by your father all your life, early on in your childhood, the association that all men are bad is a very tough conversation to have, because it's a story that you've told yourself, and it's honestly the story that's holding you together.
Yeah, it's an identity.
It's an identity. Yeah, it's exactly. It's the identity that you've put yourself together, and to break the identity, people will die to defend it. Is that so? As a story, I know we're going deep now. We're going a little deeper than theme, but actually could touch back to theme. I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I think in essence that's story. And I think that's definitely the foundational principles of character arc. The way I approach it, character arc is basically this conflict, this inner conflict between a lie the character believes and the thematic truth. And depending on the type of arc, the character might start out believing in the lie or the truth, and he might represent the truth steadfastly throughout the story. But in a positive change arc, where you have a character who starts out the story with a limiting belief of some kind, that's the essence of the story. The entire story is going to be built to put that character into situations that are going to challenge that belief, show him the limitations, and if he arcs positively, is going to bring him out of that into a greater truth. But again, in the conversation of not having it be on the nose, the way we keep that from happening is it's not easy. There's a reason we hang on to these limiting identities and these limiting beliefs, and we all do it every single minute of the day.
Every human being on the planet does it. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's, we're quite happy to stay that way, and so is the character, until something happens that, that first plot point happens and completely rocks the character's normal world.
Right.
And suddenly they have to start questioning not just, how do I defeat the bad guy, but what am I going to have to change within myself? What views, what stories, what identities am I going to have to painfully shed in order to be able to grow and move forward? Or, refuse to do that and stay where you're at, basically.
And that is basically the analogy of life. I mean, that's why we resonate so much with story and theme in general, because it is just an example of what we're going through. It helps us deal with this existence, right?
Yeah, I think that people start learning about story theory and story structure and all these ideas about theme and character arc, and a lot of times there's this feeling of like, no, I don't want to impose all of these rules onto my creativity, onto my story. And it can feel that way when you're first making all of this conscious, but the truth is exactly the opposite. The only reason we have these ideas, these theories about structure and character arc and theme, is because we've seen them arising from, thousands of years of stories and thousands of years of our lives. The psychological journey of a potent character arc is only potent in a story because we recognize and resonate with it from our own lives.
Right. The hero's journey, which is it's something that resonates pretty much in every culture around the world. It's because we've all done that. We all we all understand that. That's why it's such a powerful. That's what Joseph Campbell was talking about with the hero with 1,000 faces. Is that is a very through line. I just literally had Chris Vogler on the show, who wrote The Writer's Journey. Yeah. And I actually tell him, I'm like, Chris, let's talk for a second, Chris. A lot of people say, this hero's journey thing's out of, like, it's completely out of whack. It's done. Everybody knows it. We've all seen Star Wars. It's kind of blasé. Is it even worth dealing with the hero's journey in today's very advanced storytelling audience? The audience is so well versed It's so much harder to be a storyteller today than it was 400
totally.
years ago. 100 years ago, you could get away with so much.
Yeah, that's totally true.
And now you really got to know what you're doing. And he said something very, very, I wanted to see what he said. And he's just like, Alec, I agree with you 100%. It is one of many ways to do it, but elements of the hero's journey, all of those archetypes are in every story.
Yeah.
It's just, that's regardless if you want to believe it or not, there is always going to be a trickster somewhere, depending on the story you're telling, a trickster, a mentor, the old man, the young buck who's trying to, become a man, and all of this kind of, that's always going to be there. But he goes, but of course, there's 1,000 different kind of story structures. There's 1,000 different ways to tell that story. But the hero's journey is a model that it is the meat and potatoes. It is the foundation that we all kind of need to understand as a storyteller. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that, what I'm researching and exploring right now is the idea that the hero's journey is not the only one, specifically within just the basic, really simplistic level of archetypal mythic storytelling. And I think that's a lot of the reason why people, wonder, like, come on, hero's journey, one story, one ring to rule them all. Come on.
And by the way, you can throw the hero's journey on almost any story, like after the fact.
And the truth of it is, A, because it's that archetypal story, but also because it is, it adheres to that 3-act structure. And so those beats, that's something that I am realizing is that, yes, it looks like the hero's journey applies to all stories, and it does often. But a lot of it is that we think we're not aware of these other archetypal journeys. And so we just kind of say, there's similarities, right? They all follow a similar arc. It's just more of a life progression instead of it just being, the young buck, the hero. So I think that's part of why people don't always, it's why I didn't resonate with the hero's journey for a long time. I felt like it was just too confining. But then I started realizing, like, this is totally, it's the 3-act structure. It's right there. But the nuance, I do think that it changes and evolves. And that's something that like I said, I want to start exploring more in a series on my site soon.
Very cool.
But I'm really excited about it. But yeah, I think that the hero's journey is an incredibly important archetypal story, and that it's important because it's so simple. And I think that there's a difference between, we think sometimes that complicated stories are the way to go, the way to talk to our very sophisticated audience. And I don't think that's the truth at all. What we want is complex stories, and complexity is born out of simplicity. It's that simple archetypal layer that's provided by archetypal stories like the hero's journey, and then we get to build the complexity on top of that by really exploring those themes and asking those questions and looking at the million different, angles on a story. That's, it's complexity, but it's all coming out of the same base instead of, being who knows where all over the place.
And that brings us back to James Cameron, which is a perfect example. The Terminator is a question of, like, will the machines eventually take over? There's that. Yeah, that's right. That's one question, but will love conquer all? And
yeah, it's a very simple story. It's basically 3 characters running. That's the story.
Yeah, exactly. But there is so much complexity in that story, and the themes that he asks questions about. He asks a lot of questions in his movies, and that's I think that's what really drives his kind of storytelling. In all of the films that he's made, it is very. That's why I'm really curious about the new Avatars. All 4 of them, I think he's going to be doing for the next 8 years or something. I'm like, but anytime he comes out with something, people are like, what do you think? I'm like, dude, in Cameron, I trust. Like,
yeah,
I stopped not betting on Cameron after Titanic. I was like, you know what? Just if you can make this work, brother, you can make almost anything work, and just do you, James. You do you.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to ask you a few questions. I ask all my guests. I usually ask, like, what are 3 screenplays that every screenwriter or storyteller should read? If you don't know any specific 3 screenplays, three films which I mean, obviously we've been talking about Terminator, but
Yeah.
other films.
Yeah, I'm not much of a screenplay reader, so I will. I mean, I think that it's like super obvious, but I have to always go back to the original Star Wars because I feel like that, number one, I feel like it's gotten lost kind of in the new movies. But for me, there's no comparison. And I feel like that, I mean, that to me that's the essence of our modern myth. And so I say, go back to that one. I go back to it all the time, constantly.
But that's the hero. But that's the hero's journey. Like that is the
exactly
perfect personification of the hero's journey. And yet you go back to it constantly, even as simplistic as the hero's journey is and everything. But it's executed. It's like eating a really good apple pie. Like it's a simple thing. It's not a complex dessert that's going to explode. But if you do it well, you've got a business.
Yeah. Well, and I think we see that with Rowling, right? With the Harry Potter series. Again, I mean, so similar to Star Wars. And people just ate it up again, And honestly, to me, well, I mean, we'll leave that to the books, I guess. I was going to say the movies. But I know I recommended this the last time that I was on the show, but it's still my all-time favorite movie, so I have to say it again. And that is the classic World War II movie, The Great Escape, which was directed by John Sturges. Yeah, that one to me, there's so much. It's such a simple story. Again, guys want to escape. But so much complexity, so much character development, and the themes are so subtle. They're never stated. They're just, there, but there's all of this, just this richness and this subtext that's happening there. And then number 3, why not say Terminator? Because I do feel like there's just a lot of goodness in that story, and I think it's a really good counterpart to Star Wars, in that Star Wars is very much the male hero's journey, and Terminator is this, in my opinion, pitch perfect female, the feminine journey, the feminine psychological journey. So I think that they're really good bookends.
And it's so amazing that a man has written so many like some of the most impressive female leads in cinema history. He's written between Aliens and Terminator and all of his films that he's worked on. A lot of them have really strong. I mean, Rose. I mean, she's a pretty strong. She's essentially she ends up being the character that runs Titanic.
Well, I think, and I do think that why not? I think that archetypal, we all have this deep archetypal understanding. And when he's telling archetypal stories so well, to me, it's like, yeah, why not? And I think we see it with Rowling. There's a woman writing a story about a hero's journey and a boy. Yeah. So it's like, that's the fun of writing, that we get to explore all of these things that are different from us and do it from a place of, deep psychological understanding that sometimes we don't even know we have.
I wanted to ask you a side question because it just came up. As a storyteller, myself, and with the work that I've done over my life, as you get older, that perspective, that story you tell yourself, morphs and changes a lot. And a script that I might have written 10 years ago, I go back to and go, ouch, that is definitely a perspective of a 30-year-old. That is not the perspective of a 45-year-old man who's gone through some other stuff in the last 15 years. There's such a focus on youth and telling that youth story of the young buck turning into a man, or the virgin story of the on the woman's side. But yet, you kind of touched on this earlier, there isn't a lot of story about the third chapter in our lives, or even the second chapter. They're starting to, Lifetime pretty much runs the midlife crisis story now, either for men or women, going through like, oh God, I'm just joking. But there is more stories now about people our age, and this kind of second chapter, midway through chapter of our lives. But there is very few good stories about that, the third chapter of our lives. Can you make and it's also because it's harder to sell. Is that the main reason you think?
Well, I think it's an interesting thing because as I've been preparing to do this series, it's been very challenging to find really good examples of these later life arcs of the third act, the third act of the human life. It's because there aren't a lot of them. And I think, yes, to some degree, it's a hard sell because like you say, we're a very youth-centered culture who's terrified of death. So we really don't want to go there. And because I think a lot of times when we do see stories about the end of life, that they're not empowered stories. They're stories about, coming to terms with death in a pretty limited way. And what I'm discovering is that, there are empowering arcs. The arcs in the second act, midlife, and the arcs in the third act for the elder years, they are just as powerful and magnificent, in some ways more so than what we've grown used to with the hero's journey. And I think it's just that we as a culture have so lost touch with our elders. Very few of us really have people in our lives from that time in their lives where they can, we can see that and they can mentor us. And I think that's part of too, even, we don't have the mentor character who shows up for us in our own hero's journey when we are young. And so there is a missing piece kind of, I think, that has happened within the archetypal story of our culture. So I think it's a hard sell, but I think there are some amazing stories to be told from those later arcs. And I'm not thinking of any examples off the top of my head. Like I said, they were tough.
I can give you one that is probably as pitch perfect as humanly possible, which is Up.
Yeah, okay.
Up is as perfect. Well, Up is a masterpiece. In the first, basically that first 3 minutes is the best summary of a human life I've ever seen in my entire life. It's so well done. But it's an older character going on a hero's journey. He goes, and his mentor happens to be a Boy Scout. In many ways,
what it is it's the little boy who's going on a hero's journey. And he's the mentor, but it's told from his point of view. The characters all come full circle, right? It's the mentors in the hero's journey who are the heroes of the third act character arcs.
Right.
But we don't ever see that.
Right. That's why it was so everybody, and it's an animated kids film, which is so brilliant. I can't only Pixar could do something like that. But there aren't many good stories like that. But that's funny though. If you look, Up resonated with kids around the world, as well as every stage of life, from a kid all the way to someone in their elder years watches Up and goes, okay, I get it. And that's the kind of, if you can pull that off, you're doing something as a storyteller.
Yeah, that's the power of archetypal stories.
Now, where can people find your new book and more about you and all the cool stuff you're doing?
Yeah, so obviously the book's on Amazon and all of those places. But if they want to specifically look at what I'm doing, they can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com.
Very cool. Katie, thank you so much for being on the show. I know I want to keep talking to you. I just want to keep talking.
It's been really fun.
I love talking story. I love going deep into this kind of nerdy story stuff. And it really helps me just think about, in all honesty, it just helps you think about life more.
Totally.
It just makes you think about life. And we are in a weird time.
There's a lot to think about.
There's a lot of stuff going on right now in the world. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why we're gravitating to story and our Netflix. I have Netflix, Hulu, HBO. I got all of them, but I need something to escape to. Yeah. I need something to attach myself to escape this crazy world we're living in. But it does just help us get through the day of this insane existence that we call life. So I want to really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you so much, and keep doing the good work that you're doing.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much for having me.